It had been nearly 6 years since I'd last set foot in the old mountain house my grandfather left me, a weathered beauty perched on the edge of Whispering Pine Ridge, where the wind always seemed to carry secrets. Life had gotten in the way. Work, family, bills, and 1,000 small excuses that somehow stretched into years. But that fall morning, when the air was crisp and the first flakes of snow flirted with the sky, I finally made the trip back. The dirt road twisted through forests, dense with firs and shadows, my truck crunching over fallen pine cones and gravel. I remembered the smell of the place, cedar and rain-soaked earth, and for a moment nostalgia softened the long drive. But as I rounded the last bend and the roof of my cabin came into view, my chest tightened. Something felt wrong. The gravel driveway that had once been covered in moss was now cleared, tire tracks fresh in the dirt. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line that disappeared into the mist. My first thought was that maybe a squatter had broken in. That wasn't uncommon up here. I slowed the truck, headlights cutting through the fog, and felt that creeping unease you get when the world you remember doesn't look the same. I parked and stepped out, the cold air biting at my face. The forest was silent save for the distant caw of a raven. I walked toward the porch, boots creaking on the old boards, and froze. A wreath hung on the front door. New, clean, clearly placed by someone who'd been here recently. The curtains were drawn, and there was the faint sound of a TV inside. My heart started pounding. This was my property. The deed, the taxes, everything had been in my name since my grandfather passed. So who the hell was inside? I gripped the doorknob, gave it a twist, and found it locked. I knocked, firm but polite at first. "Hello," I called. "This is private property." For a few seconds there was only silence, then the faint shuffle of footsteps. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open just enough for me to see a woman's face, maybe in her mid-50s, hair dyed a fierce shade of blonde, wearing a robe like she'd just woken up from a nap. "Can I help you?" she snapped, eyes narrowing like I was the intruder. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my cabin. I own this land." She gave a little scoff, leaning against the frame. "No, you don't. This is part of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I live here. You're trespassing." I blinked, stunned. HOA? There had never been an HOA up here. This property had always been off-grid. No community, no rules, no fees. "Lady, I think you're confused." I pulled up my phone to show her the property app. "This house has been in my family for decades." Her smirk widened. "Oh, that's cute," she said, and slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a full minute, disbelief giving way to rising anger. I could hear her moving around inside, locking something, maybe grabbing her phone. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and called the county sheriff's office. "Yeah," I told the dispatcher, "I think someone's broken into my house. I have proof of ownership." They said they'd send a deputy up as soon as possible, but it would take time. This was the mountains, after all. I leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the cabin I'd loved since childhood. Curtains fluttered as she peeked out from behind them like a villain out of a bad movie. And I realized then this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding that ended with an apology. No, this woman had moved in, claimed my home as hers, and she was confident enough to think the law would take her side. I didn't know yet how deep her lies ran or how many people she'd fooled into thinking she was the rightful resident of my house. But as the first snow began to fall over the trees and the sound of distant sirens echoed up the mountain road, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about property, it was about principle. And Karen, as I would soon learn she was called, had just picked a fight she'd regret for the rest of her life. The snow had started to thicken when the familiar rumble of a county sheriff's SUV broke the silence that had settled over the mountain. I stood at the edge of the porch, hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, breath fogging in the cold air, watching the cruiser's headlights snake up the winding road. Inside my cabin, the woman I'd later come to call Karen was pacing behind the drawn curtains. I could see her silhouette moving, sharp and frantic, like a caged animal trying to calculate its next move. When the sheriff finally pulled up, the tires crunching to a halt on the gravel, I felt a strange mix of relief and fury. The door to the SUV opened, and out stepped Deputy Morales, a broad-shouldered man I vaguely remembered from my last trip up here years ago. His expression was neutral but guarded as he approached. "Afternoon," he greeted, his voice calm but authoritative. "You the one who called?" I nodded, showing him my ID and the property documents on my phone. "That's right, this is my land. I came back to start renovations and found this woman living inside." He frowned, looking from me to the cabin, then at the trail of smoke still rising from the chimney. "And she's still in there?" "Yeah," I said. "Claims it's part of some HOA now." Morales' brow furrowed and he let out a low whistle. "There's no HOA up this far, not that I've ever heard. That's county jurisdiction." I felt a flicker of hope. That's what I thought. The deputy walked up the steps, knocking firmly on the front door. "Ma'am, Sheriff's Department. Mind stepping out for a moment?" The house went quiet, save for the faint hiss of the fire inside. A moment later, the door opened a crack and Karen appeared again, this time dressed like she'd been preparing for a court hearing rather than a cozy night in. "Oh, thank God you're here, officer," she cried, pointing at me with all the theatrical flair of someone who'd rehearsed her lines. "This man broke into my home. He's been harassing me and threatening me." I nearly laughed out loud, but Morales held up a hand to silence me. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down," he said firmly. "He's provided documentation that says this property belongs to him." Karen's expression twisted into mock outrage. "You mean those fake papers he probably printed off the internet? I've lived here for 2 years. I pay my HOA dues. I maintain the property. This is my house." Morales blinked. "Ma'am, what HOA are you talking about? There's no registered homeowners association within 20 miles of this area." That rattled her, just for a second, but she recovered quickly, arms folding across her chest. "Oh, you must be mistaken. Whispering Pines Community Association. We have meetings, fees, rules." Morales looked at her the way a teacher might look at a child caught in a lie. "And do you have paperwork? A deed? Anything proving ownership?" She hesitated, eyes darting to the side. I don't need to show you anything. He's the trespasser." I could feel my jaw tightening, the kind of anger that comes from being accused of something you know is false. "Deputy," I said quietly, "the county records will show my name, Thomas Landry, tax payments, title, everything. I've never sold or leased this property." Morales gave a slow nod. "I'll verify that, sir." He turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, unless you can prove ownership, I'm going to have to ask you to vacate until we sort this out." The transformation was immediate. Karen's face flushed red, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is harassment. I know the law. You can't just throw me out of my own house." She stepped closer, finger jabbing at his chest, but Morales didn't flinch. "Step back, ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from calm to commanding. "Now." She froze, blinking rapidly as the authority in his voice broke through whatever fantasy she'd built around herself. I took a step forward, heart pounding. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just want my home back. You can collect your things and I'll give you half an hour to leave." That set her off again. My things? My things?" she shouted. "You're a fraud. I've put money into this house, painted the walls, fixed the plumbing, made it livable. You can't just walk in here after disappearing for years and act like you own the place." Morales sighed. "Ma'am, that's literally what ownership means." She gaped at him, speechless, her anger collapsing into disbelief. Morales called for backup to document the situation, and while we waited, Karen stood on the porch muttering to herself, pacing like a storm cloud. I noticed then the small details, the solar lights she'd planted along the walkway, the new paint on the shutters, the fresh firewood stacked neatly beside the door. She'd truly settled in, convinced this place was hers. Maybe she'd convinced herself of that lie so deeply it felt like truth, but the law didn't bend for delusion. When the second cruiser arrived, the deputies took statements, photographs, and finally escorted her to gather her belongings. She screamed the whole time, calling me names, vowing to sue me into bankruptcy, and accusing the officers of corruption. But Morales didn't budge. When she finally stomped down the driveway, shoving a duffel bag into the back of her SUV, I felt a strange quiet fall over the mountain again. "You handled that well,"
Morales said, tipping his hat. We'll file a trespass report. Might be worth changing the locks. I nodded, exhaustion flooding in as the adrenaline faded. Yeah, I said softly. Thanks, deputy. He smiled faintly. No problem, but something tells me that lady's not done yet. I watched his taillights fade into the woods, his words echoing in my mind. He was right, because as I stood there, staring at the faint indentation of tire tracks in my driveway, I noticed something glinting near the edge of the porch. A laminated HOA welcome packet with a logo I'd never seen before and a signature at the bottom. Karen's. And right then, under the pale winter sun, I realized she wasn't just some squatter. She was the self-appointed president of a homeowners association that didn't even exist. The next morning, the mountain was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that hums with something waiting to happen. I woke up in my cabin, surrounded by half-packed boxes, a busted lock, and the smell of wood smoke lingering from the fire I built just to chase off the cold. For the first time in years, I should have felt peace being back in this place. Instead, I felt that same unease crawling under my skin, like eyes were watching from the tree line. When I stepped outside to grab coffee from my truck's thermos, I saw it. A new laminated notice pinned right to my porch post. Notice of HOA violation, unauthorized occupancy. $5,000 fine. My jaw dropped. It was on official-looking paper with the same fake HOA logo I'd seen yesterday. Karen's name was typed neatly at the bottom beside the title, President Whispering Pines HOA. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. This woman had been legally evicted less than 24 hours ago, and she was already trying to fine me for living in my own home. The sheriff had been right. She wasn't done. I ripped the notice down and tossed it into the fire pit, watching the edges curl into black ash. But even as it burned, I could feel the weight of it, not as a threat, but as a declaration of war. Around noon, I drove into town to talk to the county records office, determined to end this madness once and for all. The clerk, an older man named Dan, who'd worked there since before I was born, looked at me with disbelief when I told him what was happening. There's no registered HOA under that name, he said after searching through the database. And as for this parcel, he turned his monitor toward me, showing my name clear as day, you're the sole owner. No liens, no covenants, no restrictions. That's your land, fair and square. I should have felt vindicated, but I didn't, because when I left the office, there she was, standing by her SUV across the street, watching me. Karen. Her arms were crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes, but the smirk said everything. She wasn't scared, she was planning. I walked straight up to her, careful to keep my tone steady. You're trespassing again, Karen. You know that, right? She tilted her head, her voice dripping with smug arrogance. You think this is over, honey? You're in violation of HOA policy. I've already filed a complaint. I almost laughed. With who? The imaginary board members in your head? Her lips twitched, but she didn't lose her composure. You'll see, she said. You can't just waltz in after disappearing for years and expect to push people around. We've kept this community clean. You're not welcome here. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. There is no community, Karen. There's no HOA. You've been squatting in my house, collecting money from God knows who, pretending to run a neighborhood that doesn't exist. That's called fraud. Her mask cracked then, just a flicker of fear behind the bravado. Then she turned sharply, climbed into her SUV, and sped off, gravel spitting from her tires. I didn't see her for 2 days after that. But when I came home from town one evening, my security cameras, newly installed that morning, caught something that made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't alone anymore. 3 men I didn't recognize were with her, standing by the edge of my driveway, pointing at my cabin. One carried a clipboard, another was taking pictures. The third looked like security muscle, arms crossed, scanning the tree line like he expected me to appear.
I zoomed in on the footage, and sure enough, there it was. A new laminated sign planted at the base of my driveway. Property of Whispering Pines HOA. Under review for violation. It was surreal watching people trespass on your own land like they owned it. I called the sheriff immediately, sent them the footage, and waited. When Deputy Morales showed up again, his face was a mix of disbelief and irritation. "She really doesn't know when to quit," he muttered, taking down notes. "You said she filed something." I nodded, handing him the copy of the fine notice. He scanned it, his brows rising. "This seal's fake. It's literally a clip art eagle. I can see the stock watermark." I almost smiled at the absurdity, but Morales didn't. "This is more serious than harassment now. If she's been collecting HOA fees from anyone else, that's fraud and impersonation of a legal entity." He took the papers as evidence, promised to run her name through their system, and left. That night, I locked every door, every window, and sat by the fire listening to the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd try something again. And sure enough, around midnight, I heard the crunch of tires outside. My heart jumped into my throat. I killed the lights and peered through the window. There she was again, standing in the snow with a flashlight, shining it toward my porch like she was inspecting something. Her voice carried faintly through the cold air. "You're going to regret this. You don't belong here anymore." I grabbed my phone, called the sheriff again, and stepped onto the porch, the cold cutting through my clothes. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but low, "if you don't leave right now, you're going to jail." She froze, flashlight beam catching her face, pale, wide-eyed, manic. "You can't threaten me," she screamed, then turned and ran to her SUV as sirens wailed in the distance. The deputies arrived minutes later, but she was gone, leaving only the fake sign and a set of fresh tire tracks. Morales shook his head. "We'll catch her," he said, though his tone carried the weight of someone who'd dealt with too many of her kind before. I stared at the empty road, my breath fogging in the dark, and realized something chilling. This wasn't about property anymore. It wasn't even about pride. This was obsession. Karen had convinced herself she was protecting something real, some imaginary community, and I had become her villain. And deep down, I knew she wasn't finished. The next few days were a blur of tension and sleepless nights, the kind where every sound outside made me reach for the flashlight and listen hard enough to hear my own heartbeat. I thought maybe Karen would vanish after her last outburst, but people like her never just disappear. They escalate. And I was right. On the fourth morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery, the low grind of an engine and the metallic clank of chains. My first thought was that the county had sent a crew for maintenance. My second was pure disbelief when I stepped onto the porch and saw it. A tow truck, bright orange and humming loudly, was backed halfway up my driveway. And there she was, Karen, standing in the middle of it all, bundled in a winter coat, arms folded like she owned the mountain. Behind her, one of her so-called HOA agents was attaching a chain to my pickup truck. "Hey!" I yelled, storming down the steps. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned slowly, a chilling calm in her smile. "Collecting unpaid HOA fines," she said. "You've ignored repeated violations. This vehicle is being impounded." For a moment, I thought she was joking, until I saw the man in a fake security vest waving me off like he had authority. "Back away, sir. This is official HOA business." That's when my patience finally snapped. "You touch that truck, and I'll have you all arrested," I barked. Karen rolled her eyes, pulling out a clipboard filled with nonsense paperwork. "You've been warned. We're authorized to remove non-compliant property under Section 14 of the Whispering Pines Residential Code." "That's not even real," I shouted, stepping closer. "There is no Section 14, there's no code, and there sure as hell isn't a Whispering Pines HOA. She waved a dismissive hand. "Says who?" "Says the county," came a voice behind me. I turned, and there stood Deputy Morales again. This time, not alone. Two patrol cars idled at the bottom of the driveway, red and blue lights flashing against the snow. Morales's face was grim, eyes fixed on Karen. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Karen's confidence faltered for just a second. "This is private HOA business, officer," she said, voice trembling. "You don't have jurisdiction." Morales took a slow step forward. "Ma'am, you are trespassing on private land and attempting to commit vehicle theft. You want to test my jurisdiction?" The two men she'd brought with her exchanged nervous glances, one already inching toward the truck cab. Morales gestured to his deputies, hands where I can see them. The command cracked through the cold morning air like thunder. The fake security guard froze. Karen's face turned white, her jaw clenched. "This is harassment! He's lying! He abandoned this property for years. It fell under HOA oversight." Morales ignored her, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "County verified the records, ma'am. This land belongs to Mr. Landry. Your HOA doesn't exist. In fact, it looks like you've been collecting fees from residents in the lower valley under false pretenses." That did it. Her composure shattered. "That's not true!" she shrieked, voice breaking. "They wanted me to organize it. They needed leadership." Morales sighed, like a man tired of explaining reality to a wall. "Ma'am, we have affidavits, statements, and proof you've been posing as an official body. You violated multiple fraud statutes." He turned to his deputies. "Place her under arrest." The color drained from her face as the deputies approached her. She stepped back, shaking her head. "You can't do this to me! I'm the president!" she cried, but the words were hollow now. They cuffed her as the fake HOA agents were ordered to the ground. I stood a few feet away, my breath visible in the cold, heart pounding with disbelief. Karen thrashed as they read her rights, screaming that this was a setup, that I'd forged everything, that she wasn't finished. But when they guided her into the back of the cruiser, she looked smaller somehow, deflated, like the wind had finally been knocked out of her delusion. Morales lingered after they loaded her in, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "We'll get statements from the others. She's looking at charges for trespassing, fraud, and harassment. Probably more once the DA gets the paperwork." I nodded, still staring at the spot where she had stood. The snow began to fall heavier, muffling everything. The hum of engines, the chatter on police radios, even Karen's distant ranting as the cruiser door shut. For the first time in weeks, the air around the cabin felt still again. Morales gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and warming. "You might want to stay here a few days. Folks like her, they don't always take defeat quietly." I managed a tired smile. "Thanks, Deputy. I'll be fine. I've got cameras now, and locks that work." He chuckled softly. "Good. You earned your peace." When the patrol cars finally drove off, their lights fading into the forest mist, I stood alone in the quiet, the snow falling thick and slow around me. I looked at my cabin, the cracked windows, the old timber, the smoke curling from the chimney, and for the first time it felt like mine again. But as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye. A small envelope tucked under one of the porch steps. I picked it up, tore it open, and inside was a handwritten note in neat looping cursive. "You may have won this time, but Whispering Pines will always belong to us." No signature, just that single sentence. I exhaled slowly, letting the snow soak into the paper until the ink bled into gray streaks. Karen might be gone, but her madness had left a mark, not just on the property, but on the idea that anyone could take something that wasn't theirs and believe they were right. I tossed the note into the fire, watched it crumble to ash, and sat in silence, the cabin creaking softly around me. The mountain was mine again, scarred, but standing. And if there was one thing I'd learned from it all, it was that some battles you win in court, but others you win simply by staying put, refusing to be scared away, and watching the world burn itself out.